Hello, thank you for joining us in this channel again. Today we're interviewing Omri Boehm. He's a professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. Full disclosure, he was my dissertation advisor, so he suffered me extensively. He's from Israel. He's published several books, including one on the binding of Isaac that we will discuss in this interview. Also, he has a forthcoming book on Israel. I want to ask Omri about that as well. The book will be out in German in a month, and it will be entitled, or is entitled, Israel Utopia. And then in English, in the New York Review of Books in the winter, with a slightly different title that I will ask you about as well, A Future for Israel. Slightly less optimistic than in German, which is weird, because Germans are less optimistic than Americans.
Future, utopia, I mean, we can talk about it.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us, for giving us your time to discuss. The topic I'd like to discuss with you is the topic of obedience, because governments all around the world have, asked the citizens, not exactly nicely, but they have asked the citizens to stay at home. Some countries harder than others. In Spain, it's been one of the hardest quarantines in the world, almost like a house arrest. And most of the people are spontaneously obeying to these commands. Some people are not. Some people are protesting or even disobeying with no political discourse behind it, just plainly free riding on the situation. And I'd like to...
By the way, interesting, not just the house quarantine, but also the masks, I think. The question of the obedience with the masks is very performative in this.
I saw a video some days ago in the New York City subway, a woman who was arrested forcefully, like with a lot of violence, because she refused to wear properly the mask. She had a mask, but she wasn't...
She was arrested for touching her face, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And sometime I'd like to talk with someone about faces. I would like to talk about what are we losing when we cover our faces. But this will be a topic for another conversation, probably about Levinas and those kinds of...
I don't know, we could, I was going to say, you said faces, I was going to say Levinas, and one could maybe speak about Levinas and obedience, but let's see if we get to that. Okay. I think that face and obedience, that will have a lot to do with that, actually.
Okay, let's begin with like very pedestrian question. Are you obeying?
All the time. All the time. I obey when I speak English, the laws of English grammar. When I speak Hebrew, less consciously, the laws of Hebrew grammar. For example, yeah, there is no such a thing as disobeying. We always obey. The question is what we choose to obey and what we choose to, well, not follow by obeying something else.
That's a very interesting discussion. Let me rephrase the question. Are you obeying the laws that ask you to stay at home and wear a mask and all that in New York?
I don't know if those are strictly speaking laws, and that actually may be important, right? When we speak about obedience, whether something is actually imposed as a law or as a recommendation, right? It's not necessarily the same thing to obey a law or to comply to a request or invitation or a suggestion. Those are not the same, not exactly the same actions. But sometimes when my father, who's Jewish, is being asked whether he eats kosher food, he answers, well, sometimes. I'm going to give you the same answer about my obedience to the, prescriptions by, the state or the city, whether I obey them or not. Well, sometimes. And the truth is, most of the times I do. To be perfectly honest, I haven't been great with the masks. I definitely put the mask on when I'm in contact with people. If I go grocery shopping, if I enter a shop, I absolutely put a mask. I think that's, I think it's wrong not to do it. On the street, I walk less. I walk very little, frankly. But when I do, I don't quite wear the mask. You know what I do? I hold it in my hand to show the angry people that in principle I have it, and that I can, if coming in close contact with people, then I can put the mask. But people are very angry. And you definitely get dirty looks from people who look at you as someone who's not complying, is endangering them. Yeah.
You already said two things that are very interesting. First is the distinction between a law and a requirement. I don't know, a suggestion. I think we are in a very weird moment now in which these things that they are telling us to do are not exactly laws. So they have not passed through the processes that make a law a law. Mm-hmm. The kind of whatever, debate, background culture, parliamentary discussion, elections, all that. But at the same time, they are not just suggestions either. They are something more than suggestions. They are norms, or they are orders or commands that the authorities are giving us under the assumption that we are in a sort of state of exception that allows them to make those kinds of requests. In the case of Spain, I'm not sure about the US or New York State, but in the case of Spain, the legal term is state of alarm, which is a legal term that it's not exactly a state of exception, because there exists a state of exception, but in this case, it's just a state of alarm, which allows the government.
Is there also such a thing, the state of alarm, or is this an invention that's more rhetorical than legal?
No, there exists a legal disposition that it's called the state of alarm, that it's for cases like this, like sanitary emergencies, these kind of things, that allows the government to, do certain things that regularly they could not. And the law says that every other week they have to approve the state of alarm in Parliament to keep going. It's been renewed several times now, I think 5 or something like that. And we have an upcoming parliamentary meeting, I think this week, that we will see if it will be extended, which probably will, because there's a majority of parties that will support this. So that's the first thing. We are in a very exceptional moment in which norms are as strong or as enforceable as laws, but they are not exactly laws. Does that change anything about our relationship with government, or should it change our view of these norms in some way?
That's an interesting question, and to be perfectly honest, I haven't thought about it that much. But it's interesting. Right? It's interesting to think about the question whether the relation between a government and its citizens needs to go through the concept of law or not. Right? So that when you give a certain order, you do this by legislation, which is then also done by parliament, by representatives. There has to be a vote about it. There has to be a certain debate in parliament about it. It can be then overruled, I take it, by the Supreme Court one way or another, who can, strike out laws that are not legal and so forth. And then the government can come and say, oh, we just recommend that you will do something. We just suggest that you do this and that. It's not a law. It's something else. When the government does that, it sounds, in many ways, less totalitarian, and arguably it is less totalitarian. On the other hand, potentially, it's a way of government of ruling that's less open to criticism, that's not as vulnerable, in the best sense of the term, vulnerable to the separations of power, and so forth, right? So I think that's an interesting and potentially dangerous
So you're saying that the fact that some of these requests are just suggestions which in principle should look as if they were less stringent or less authoritarian, because it's just suggestions. The fact that they are suggestions free them from the kind of control that actual laws, you know.
I wouldn't be 100% opposed to governments making suggestions to citizens. I mean, governments should invite citizens, encourage citizens, suggest to citizens, and so forth. When it becomes a way of ruling, a way of actually directing the population, when the government suggests to citizens to actually fulfill some of their deepest rights, and it does so not by actually giving an order, which would then have to be debated, legislated, debated in the Supreme Court and so forth, but just suggesting, and for that reason is not open to that, then we're facing, again, on the one hand, an understandable act. The government is not going to come and say, well, you do not have those rights anymore. On the other hand, a problematic act, because the government can do so without being open to the normal, familiar instruments of democracy to defend itself from illegal legislation. Right? That's part of the danger. You have to tie it to another danger, which is the danger that citizens, quote unquote, obey. Not quote unquote, they do, right? They don't disobey. And the government is also doing this because it knows that citizens would obey that much more if it will not give an order, right? So citizens very comfortably obey that, and they start obeying that very intimately. They start believing in the rightness of doing this very intimately. Again, the danger the danger here is precisely has something to do with the fact that those requests are very reasonable and very understandable and should be respected, right? I'm not for not respecting many of those suggestions, but I'm also not for ignoring the danger that's imposed by them, with governments that receive a lot of power and citizens that, in my experience, are getting used to obey collectively very much. Yeah.
You also said that when you walk down the street with your mask on your hand.
Should not have said that right now, my friends. I'm already, yeah.
People get very upset. That's what you said. In your favor, I must say that the studies so far have shown that contagion, in open air spaces is extremely rare. But why are people angry? Because, and at some level, it's easy to understand that if people fear contagion, they fear this sickness. That's reasonable to be angry. But it seems as if people have, I don't want to overstate this, but people have assumed a role of policing other people's behaviors.
I really think that that's exactly right. People, there's something performative about the mask. Again, we should not underestimate the real dangerous situations. The mask can make a difference for the better. It's important to say that definitely in some spaces like grocery shops, I don't know, taxis, the subway, it seems to me that it's extremely important today to comply with those requirements or requests or laws, depending in which country you are. That said, there's also something extremely performative about the mask. What is it that I'm saying when I am wearing the mask? And it really does say just that, right? I'm obeying. I'm following what good people do. It's interesting how there is this immediate response, I think emotional response, to the sight of people refusing to do that, right? I see an immediate connection. I walk here, I walk down the street in Park Slope, and I see people really standing on their stoop with their children next to nobody, wearing masks because they're outside. And that's their way of expressing something. We obey, we are careful. We teach our children to be careful and respectful. You walk there without it, they're already angry. There's a certain relation between the sheer uselessness of having the mask when you're on your stoop, but expressing that you do what the government says, and the response to people who, exercise common sense, let's say, and would wear the mask when they think they need it, and would not wear it when they don't. Part of the problem, part of the danger, I think, is actually exactly in the opposition to common sense now, right? Look, I'm going to wear the mask if I'm going to the grocery shop, but if I'm alone on the street and you're on the other side, I'm not wearing a mask. The anger to that is part of the culture of obedience that seems to me very dangerous. You've lived enough in the US. My feeling is that in the US, it's a familiar problem. It's a familiar problem with the issue of smoking. Again, smoking is bad to your health, but there's a certain real, what I've called, I think with you one day, fascio-liberalism, right? There's a certain feeling that if you do not comply, exactly, if you smoke in the park, you're already endangering people. We see a lot of that here right now, and it's unfriendly. It's unfriendly. I stopped hearing you, Jordan.
Sorry, I muted the mic so your voice was better heard. Our system is built around the idea that two ideas. Our system, I mean liberal democracies, are built around two ideas. One is that there may be a law, but then the law very seldomly covers exactly what life is, and therefore we have always to examine the case to see whether someone was justified in disobeying some norm in a certain circumstance, or maybe that person was really obeying, but apparently he or she was not, but in truth he or she was. So there's no direct relationship between the text of the law and actions, but and the second thing is that connection must be done by someone specifically appointed to that purpose. There are several people. There's the police officer, and then there's the state attorney, and then there's a judge, right? And several judges who analyze whether your actions are in compliance with the law or not. There's a division of labor, so to speak, of those kinds of things. On the other hand, if you see a crime being committed, if you hear your neighbors having a domestic abuse kind of situation, or if you see a child being mistreated, or if you see, you're compelled to act, right? You have a moral or even a legal obligation to do something or say something. We see this in subway ads, right? For many years since 9/11. If you see something, say something, right? There's something about citizens, being on watch, so to speak. But part of what living in a democracy means is the idea that your fellow citizen will not judge your actions because it's not his or her place to do so. And what we've seen these past weeks in here as well, in Barcelona as in New York, is that people have assumed the role of enforcers of this situation, which makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable and realize that they're being watched more than they thought, right? Those private judgments that people have with respect to other people's behaviors now have become public or explicit. And I don't know if that's exceptional in the sense that when this is over, this attitude will be over as well, or if it signals a sort of a change in the way we will treat each other in the public space.
Well, I don't know either what will happen in the future, but
Nobody
I
does.
agree. Yeah, but I agree with you about that feeling, and we need to notice that's one reason why always the question of the plague was so deeply related to the question of democracy and freedom, right? Because that's precisely the moment. If you have the position between the masses, right? The Germans would call it the Auseinandersetzung, the confrontation between the masses, citizens as a public, as opposed to the government. That's one way to balance the power of the government. Another one is to separate between citizens and to make all of them suspicious of each other. We know this, we're familiar with this in places like the DDR, Eastern Germany and so forth, where citizens basically have to be suspicious of each other, so they do not really unite, say, against the government and so forth. The plague is creating very similar terms because it separates citizens who are no longer, for the fear of not being pure. You do not connect with the masses. You do not touch them. You prefer not to see them. You do not walk with them. You definitely don't demonstrate in a mass demonstration against the government where bodies touch each other and people sweat. We seek purity rather than the mess that's necessarily tied to the public sphere. And that promotes in many ways, the power of government, but which always falls back on collaboration of citizens. And people, I think, also underestimate. Right, we are so accustomed to taking for granted liberal democracy that we don't really understand that there are real threats of giving up on the power of the public sphere. That disobedience really is important in order to prevent governments from having too much power.
Right? I agree 100% with what you're saying, and I think we all say this in a way. In a way, we say it's dangerous to forget that the freedoms that we enjoy, however small they are or imperfect they are, they should not be taken for granted. And it's dangerous to go down a path that. But it's very difficult to make that a specific thing, like a concrete thought. We can say in general, well, because in this situation, it's very easy to say, well, come on, guys, it's an exception, right? It's in a parenthesis. It's a suspension of that for a moment, right? And it's very difficult to elaborate a reasoning, an argument that will show how from this moment of anger against you on the street, or from this moment of absolute compliance, it can come a moment in which we cannot go back to the kinds of freedoms.
I think the most important thing that's emerging from what we're saying, that we agree about one fundamental point. The real danger is not coming from the government. The real danger is coming from the loss of an understanding of a certain freedom of citizens, a certain way of thinking of citizens, rather than a government now trying to take over. We've seen that too. For example, where I come from, in Israel, we've seen actions that really looked like a coup. And we can talk about this or not, it doesn't matter. But you can see moments like that where you can actually say the government or a certain person is trying to take over. We, I think, in this conversation agree that for our purposes, the interesting, dangerous question is actually not that immediately, but rather the danger that the citizens are the ones who are being complicit in a culture of obedience, that through which then freedom can be lost. That's yeah. I worry less about governments than about cultures that can be that can promote a certain type of obedience, loss of freedom, and so forth. That's definitely been my experience in Israel. Look, Israel is definitely losing its democracy. I think that goes without saying. It's not because the government is doing something against its citizens. It's completely by the will of the citizens. Right? The citizens are completely complicit in certain ways of giving up now, not just on the freedoms of the Palestinians, but their own freedoms. This is what they want. And those tend to be today, I think, the main problems, rather than some general having a military coup.
Let me save that thought for later, because I really like you to tell us about how you see Israel. But just to go back to your first statement, which you said many things, and I think all of them deserve to be disentangled. You said there's no such thing as disobedience, in the sense that when you disobey a law, you're obeying something else. You're obeying. Can you elaborate that thought a little bit?
The thought is that we always act by having some kind of a concept in mind, some kind of a principle that we follow, some kind of an aim, an end of action when we act. If we don't act. And so if we refuse to do something, we refuse to do that thing in the name of something else, which we position as more important. You know, if I refuse to go to the military in Israel, which for the record I didn't. I don't.
You didn't refuse.
I didn't refuse. I went. Yeah, important to say somehow.
Famously, actually.
Yeah. Well, whatever. If I refuse, say, to go to the military or to fight a war, you can call my action. You can describe rightfully. You can, truthfully describe my action as disobeying in some sense. But in the larger picture, I'm actually obeying, say, my conscience. Right? That's one obvious example of what I mean when I say that there is no such a thing as disobedience. There is no such a stance of being disobedient. Even the ones, and we both know them from some people, and say the new school, usually younger students, there's a certain attitude of being radically disobedient. You want to just disobey. Even those people, frankly, they obviously obey. What is it that they obey? That's the reason why I personally oppose this attitude. They obey the aspiration to be cool, I think. They obey a certain attitude that they think is important. Let's say they don't obey the aspiration to be cool. Let's not ridicule them. They obey a certain form of anarchism that they believe, right? And they think is important. They obey something. The question is what? The deep question, I think, for mature people is always what is it that you obey? How do you obey well, rather than what is it that you disobey? And to be sure, disobedience is always important, but it is precisely important because some principles that we follow, that is obey, are important. Another question is, the next question is going to be, what are we talking about when we're talking about obedience? Is obedience the same as slavery or being enslaved? So when I'm autonomous and I obey my own law, famous Kantian ideal of autonomy, do I actually then enslave myself? Or is it a form of actually being free as Kant would have it? That's a good question. The question is also then has to do with how we think about action, how we think about positive freedom rather than negative freedom, and so forth. all deep philosophical questions. But I don't see how, in the end of the day, in the end of the day, there is a way of actually not obeying. Much better to ask, what is it that I obey? What is it that I follow?
Let me play a little bit devil's advocate on behalf of my new school fellow tuition payers, in saying that, well, there seems to be a taxonomy of both obedience and disobedience, in the sense that it's not the same obeying or disobeying for the sake of disobedience, as you said, or for the sake of obedience, than disobeying on behalf of a consciously embraced principle or consciously embraced priority. It could very well be that sometimes disobedience, we see this in children, right? Sometimes disobedience is an instinctive reaction to protect freedom of action without knowing exactly what you are. There's no material content to the disobedience. There's no.
Did you say, Joe? Did you say instinctive?
Yeah, I did.
Great. So that's already my answer to you, right? To the extent that it's an instinct, it's not an action. An instinct is not an action, right? If you put your hand in the fire, when you put the hand in the fire, that's your action. When you take it back by an instinct, that's not your action. That's something that happens to you. The agent is years of evolution, making you your nerve system and your body responses to take your body back from fire.
Okay, let me rephrase that. I'll say intuition. I'll say intuition. You're, instead of instinct, I'll say you're in a fog. You don't know exactly what, but you know that there's something wrong which you cannot point to, but there's something wrong with convention or the norm or the law. And then you disobey, because as long as you disobey, you maybe gain time to think about it, or you protect a space of uncertainty that has no content. That's fundamentally different from, say, I don't want to go to the Israeli military because I think what they do is immoral or fruitless. And there's a, right, or even in this taxonomy, right, it's not the same being lazy, disobeying out of laziness, saying I don't want to put on the mask because it's uncomfortable or I don't feel like it, than saying I've carefully distinguished between being inside a grocery store from being on the street alone or in a park alone, and therefore I can, balance.
I disagree. I'm not sure I completely understand the distinctions you make and the question that you're raising, but I think that let's call it philosophically speaking, this is actually similar. Just for the very basic, call it technical claim that when I do either of those actions, go to the military or not put a mask where there are not many people, I make something, to now use the Kantian language, I make some maxim, some principle, the maxim of my action. And I make that maxim rather than the one dictated, say, by the state, my maxim. That's already a meaningful action. To be, not to sound pathetic, it would have been almost more comfortable for me. I don't know if you've seen the streets of Brooklyn, but I know you can imagine. I'm not sure many people in your Catalan audience can imagine. But I think you can imagine that today walking down the streets of Park Slope without a mask is almost less comfortable than with a mask. When I don't, I almost feel that I'm doing something
heroic,
something important. I will go so far as heroic, but important. You know, I'm not completely kidding. I feel
I know
it's
you're
important
not.
to preserve. You really feel the pressure of society telling you to do something. You say, listen, relax. I actually think we should go on using our common sense. I think there should be room for exercising judgment and so forth. I'm not killing you by exercising my common sense and deciding that when I walk here in a basically empty street and there's another few more persons walking, if I don't wear a mask, I'm not killing it. You know? There is something important in if the people who put a mask feel that they express something, they show something, I feel I'm doing the same. And that is actually the maxim of my action. It really is, frankly. Well, it really is. As Hannah Arendt famously said, the human heart is a deep place. I don't really know what the maxim, what
I know.
my action are, but I can at least describe it as a possible maxim. Perhaps I'm just a lazy bastard, and I don't put on a mask because, sorry, not a lazy bastard, but a vain bastard who wants to, doesn't think it's aesthetic enough.
Well, you're generous. You're sharing your beauty with the world. But just to push you a little bit on that, you're arguing that there's no significant philosophical difference between these different kinds of obedience or disobedience that I'm trying to. Let me. I'll give you an example, and also I just thought about a philosophical theory. I'm going to say it by memory, so if I'm wrong, I mean, it, just correct me. But the example is this. I know someone, friend of mine, who's very anxious about what's going on. She's tends to be in the spectrum of hypochondria, right? And usually worried about, it's overwhelming. Let's say the word is overwhelming, right? It's stronger than her reasoning. And even though she believes that the government is doing a bad job in handling this, and she agrees that the reasons why they're deciding whether to promote a lockdown or open it up, or all those reasons are more political than sanitary, right? Obeying gives her peace of mind in the sense that the responsibility is not hers. The responsibility is not.
Well, it's true about all of us, right? I mean, all of us always, when we that's a familiar issue, right? Is the fact that obeying, well, to take it to a place that's very far-fetched, I believe there is a famous quote by Hitler once saying, I saved Germans from their freedom. There is of course, there is comfort in,
which is a true statement, actually.
Well, I guess, I mean, religions function this way, and hey, not just religions, also the religion that's called arguably liberal democracy is in some ways functions this way, right? Some type of obedience saves you from your anxiety, saves you from your freedom. That's why I insist, and this is, this potentially is a deep philosophical conversation that I don't pretend to have the answers in it. The question of how to obey becomes an important one, because obedience does save us from our freedom. Are there ways in which obey actually makes us free?
The theory I wanted to point to is Kohlberg's phases of moral development. It's a psychological theory and very Kantian. He says that we have a pre-moral state of obedience, childlike. Our parents told us not to cross the street when the street light is red, and because the authority says so, we just obey, or not, but we do. If we do, we obey for that reason, right?
Sure.
Then we have a conventional heteronymous kind of compliance. Like the government says that when the traffic light is red, we should not cross. And then there's a post-conventional autonomous understanding of that law, in which you reflect and you say, well, the reason this law exists is because when my street light is red, someone else's is green, and then cars are passing, and then I could die or I could kill someone. Therefore, I don't cross when the street light is red. But if the street is empty, if there's nobody around, if I'm alone and the street light is red, I can cross because I understand the content of the law, and then I make a decision, right? Would you agree in like this? I don't know if I've explained this well.
I can be familiar with this picture. I think the question we're asking is actually deeper than that, because it is about are we actually obeying on the autonomous level? I would argue that we are, but then I think the question immediately. By the way, I know some people who would claim that when you do something autonomously in this way, you're not obeying, because you do not accept the authority of anything, right? So maybe first let's introduce that distinction. The childlike type of obedience is childlike obedience because something is done on the basis of just accepting authority. The reason why I did something was that I accept the authority of the person who said it, right? This is why also religions are so infantile, right? Because they have the same structure. Why do you do this? Well, I do this because a priest told me. I do this because a rabbi told me. Why is this true? Well, because a prophet said it. And by the way, same for God. Why do you do this? Because God said it, right? Religions have this infantile, at least allegedly, at least initially, infantile structure of obedience. There can be then the level in which you say, I don't do this because the rabbi told me. I don't do this because a prophet told me. I don't do this because God told me. I do this because I understand why it's good. And so the authority is not with the rabbi. The authority, and now the tricky question, the authority is with me. It's a tricky question because is the authority with me or with reason? Is there a difference between me and reason, right? One thing is clear, I now refuse the authority of the other. I refuse the authority of God. I refuse the authority of the prophet. I refuse the authority of the priest. Is it now the assertion of my authority, Omri? Is it the assertion of the authority of reason? Or are they the same somehow, right? And how do we understand then this moment? Am I obeying then reason as opposed to the priest? Am I obeying myself as opposed to the priest? What am I doing when I'm doing that? And I think, unsurprisingly, psychologists are often, they're a bit quick with their distinction. So I'm not surprised that when you start going with psychological gradings, you just say in the end, and then we have the level of mature, responsible adults who are just autonomous. Well, there's a question.
The fault is in my explanation. I'm not sure if Kohlberg was as simple as my explanation was. Just in case, I want to say this because
It's possible that even Kant was too fast there. I'm not sure, but there's a real question. And that would be also eventually the question of what does it mean to say that we obey or not, right? Are we doing here something that's genuinely free and somehow just transcends obedience? Or are we free because we obey? In Kant, famously, we're free because we obey the categorical imperative, right? Maybe too fast and simplistic and unsatisfying for the modern world, but still a question.
Just to introduce, I don't want to talk about your military experience exactly because I know you don't like to talk about it. No, but you said in a piece in the New York Times, you mentioned it in passing, And I'm not interested in your experience in particular, but about the military itself, or if you want, Eichmann's argument, if you want, right? In which you are in a context in which
Did you just compare me to Eichmann?
I didn't.
I'm kidding.
I actually explicitly didn't.
This is why I was so worried, John.
But you've said in writing that in the military you're asked to do something that go against your consciousness or your set of values or your moral landscape, and you obey, or you, not you, but in general, right? It's a context. It's a context in which you must obey, either out of coercion or either out of something else that we don't know. It's the argument of Eichmann because it's necessary compliance, chain of command, and it's a way of saying this is not my responsibility. In the same sense in which my friend obeys the requests of the government to just put pressure off her responsibility. And is there a question of responsibility in obedience when obedience is not, self-conscious and all that, but it's just, an act of either coercion or just going with the flow of the context?
Well, going with the flow and coercion, and by the way, the flow might be the most effective way of coercing people. Think about it. There are ways in which going with the flow and coercion, which are just ways of making actions not yours, right? So when you go with the flow, when you're being coerced, you basically are you're not even obeying in some sense. You're just not acting. And that's precisely the point. Look, you can go and serve in the military, even if you disagree with it, autonomously, right? Because, and this is an important part of every discussion about, say, conscientious disobedience. Right? There's some big questions, familiar questions. Makes perfect sense to say, look, I oppose this or that war. I oppose a war in Vietnam, but I still go, and I go because what I autonomously believe in is, say, the rule of law. And the state now commands that I do something, even though politically I oppose it, from the depths of my heart, I would still go and do that. Because I believe that citizens should follow the law. So there would be still a description in which even going to serve in Vietnam, even going to serve in Gaza, and so forth, would be a form of autonomous action, even if you disagree with those wars, to be autonomous. You would believe that the conditions of autonomy require, among other things, a state and a law and a legal system and the respect of citizens to what a state has decided. This is why you cooperate, right? There can be the limiting situations, the real extreme situations in which a citizen, precisely if she is respectful of the law, can also come out and say, doing this or that action is humiliating me. It crushes who I am as an agent. And for that reason, I would disobey. Right? So the liberal states are usually committed to giving this space to citizens to say, precisely out of the recognition that the law is important, even if they disagree with it, to still have a corner in which they say, if I follow that command, who I am will be crushed. I cannot do this. And the state, a liberal state, because it's supposed to be committed to valuing the respect of citizens, will not coerce them to do it, right? Let's say I deeply believe that demolishing houses of Palestinians in the occupied territories is not just wrong. It's something that I cannot do. There are children living there. There are elderly living there. It's not just about the political disagreement about whether Israel should be controlling the West Bank or not. Going and demolishing those houses is acts of retaliation. It breaks who I am as a person. So I go to the state and I say, look, you cannot coerce me to go and do this. You cannot make me a criminal of that level in my own eyes. So I disobey the law, right? That's a question of the relation that I think you raised between conscience and obedience. So in many, many moments, what I'm trying to cover here, Jody, is the difference between following and obeying many principles, many laws with which I disagree, but still doing so autonomously. And the principle of autonomy in which I still say, well, some things I still would not.
I don't want to compare you with Eichmann, but there's something in what you say that resonates a little bit with, at least in Haretz's book, because Eichmann made 2 points in his defense. One was, I was just obeying. That's the first, right? But there was a second argument, which was, I was just managing trains, right? So in the sense that you could say, I don't want to be in Gaza demolishing houses in retaliation, and I could be your superior and say, fine, you just pick up the phone in my office, right? You don't have to go there and demolish the houses. The action that will crush your dignity, you will not be asked to perform it. But please mop the floor, because we need someone to mop the floor here, right? And the action of mopping the floor is not demolishing the house, and maybe it's not crashing but that's exactly Eichmann's point, right? I was not killing millions of Jews in concentration camps. It was just, scheduling trains.
If Eichmann opted to mop the floor instead of manage the trains, he would not have been. It would have been wrong to execute him. I would not have executed a Nazi mopping the floor somewhere in Berlin. That would have been wrong, and I don't think that would have made Eichmann complicit for mopping the floor. We're all then complicit in the worst crimes, if this is what participating comes down to. If someone, there are some people who, as some form of expression, want to say, I will not wear a uniform. That's understandable. It's very different from refusing to wear a uniform, refusing to join the military. Whether I respect that refusal or not is a completely different question. It's a completely different act from saying, I will not actively participate in demolishing a house. Right? If you wear a uniform and mop the floor somewhere, you're not participating in killing anybody. Sure, you may be legitimizing a certain type of military, you may be complicit, but then you're complicit even for speaking Hebrew, you're complicit for, speaking German in Eichmann's case, for sure. I don't think that those are the problems we're talking about. It's precisely to make the distinction, if we accept the idea that perhaps I can be autonomous and obey things even if I disagree with them, and still preserve my ability to say some things I would disobey because they cross a certain border and humiliate me as a subject. Look, you mentioned Eichmann and his claim that he was merely following orders. The problem is even deeper than that. And it's again familiar from Israel. But Israel here is just an example. That's not the main, as part of the discourse and the response to the Eichmann trial, not exactly, but never mind now the whole history, Israel's military has introduced a very famous clause in its code of ethics, which is called the duty to disobey a manifestly illegal order. In the land, again, it's more complicated than that, but in the land of Holocaust survivors who know something about Eichmann in that sense, you say, well, obeying an illegal order, a manifestly illegal order, cannot excuse you from being a criminal. Right? So that we're not going to have a military of little Eichmann, the argument would go. Problem with this is precisely the problem with this question of obedience, right? And it has everything to do with that answer given by Eichmann. A manifestly illegal order, as opposed to an illegal order, right? Because a military needs to follow orders. A manifestly illegal order, by the famous quote from an Israeli judge, is an order that pierces the eye to a level that cannot be, is obvious.
There's no plausible deniability.
That's right. And so you have now a military, the Israeli military, that for 50 years now, almost all the time, does not do that, right? Does not take, hundreds of Palestinian children and just shoots them against a wall or something like that. Israeli soldiers are trained to disobey orders of that type. They just obey for 50 years illegal orders, some of them terribly illegal orders, house demolitions, expulsions, arrests in the middle of the night of children. Those are not manifestly illegal orders, arguably, and they're just illegal. Wasn't that actually the problem with Eichmann, right? The problem with Eichmann was precisely of the banality of evil, not of the exception, right? So the question of obedience to something that's the rule rather than the exception becomes a really deep problem. How to disobey an extreme right, crazy commander telling you to take an innocent child and kill them. That's, hopefully people will know to do that when the chips are down, but that's not the deep question here. The deep question is about obedience to a certain norm that precisely as norm commands.
Well, it's manifestly legal. What Eichmann did was manifestly legal.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's precisely the point. By the way, it points to an interesting difference between Arendt and Carl Schmitt. I don't think that this is a space to think about it deeply, but Carl Schmitt famously problematizes the moment of the Ausnahmezustand, right? The moment of the state of exception. The exceptional becomes the main question with which liberal democracies need to be thinking their theories of power and obedience. I think Arendt is much deeper because she formulates exactly the other insight. It is that not the state of exception, but the state of banality, the opposite of exception, is the main problem, right? I think we're confronting it more and more today. Again, definitely where I come from in Israel. I don't think that we've seen this widely. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's now my chauvinistic Israeli perspective. Perhaps we are seeing this in America, which is doing terrible things. Perhaps we are seeing this in other places in the world. America has been complicit in pretty awful things, and the question of our compliance with a certain law. cannot be abandoned. It's been especially vivid for me personally as an Israeli, that the question of disobeying a manifestly illegal order, which Israelis love to quote. I don't know if you've heard, I don't know if your viewers are familiar with the famous claim that the Israeli military is the most moral military in the world. This is something that all Israelis know to rehearse, and also definitely readers of the New York Times. It's built, among other things, by this famous clause. Israel teaches its soldier to disobey a manifestly illegal order. That's actually exactly the repression of the real question on the table, right? The question is not of disobedience to crazy commands, but of obedience to a certain law, which is itself criminal. Do we face the same problem also in the US? Do we face the same problem in Spain? Those are the questions.
Take my hand and lead me to deeper philosophical waters. I want to ask you about three texts that are relevant to our discussion. The first one is Plato's Crito. For our listeners or viewers that are not familiar with this, Crito is a dialogue by Plato that goes chronologically in the narrative time after the Apology, which means it's after the trial of Socrates, and it's after Socrates has been sentenced to death, and then he's in jail, and Crito tries to convince him to escape from jail so that he can escape the sentencing of like drinking the poison, and Socrates refuses to disobey, right? The sentencing and escaping. What do we learn from this position by Socrates?
Things that we learn a question that is as fascinated me also in my writings on Kant. And it has something to do with the relation, again, between thinking, freedom, and surprisingly obedience rather than disobedience, right? Because I like to address the Crito moment through Kant. Kant famously defines enlightenment, right, as having the courage to think for yourself. Having the courage to think for yourself. And that courage to think for yourself is defined as maturity, right? Overcoming your childhood. But Kant also says in the essay, think for yourself, but obey. And people have been extremely angry with Kant, right? The German philosopher, the little Eichmann, how come he says, think for yourself, but obey? So the first thing that I like to begin with when I teach this text is to go exactly to Crito. To say, look, Kant's position, Kant, arguably the timid, obedient German dry philosopher, his position is in exact agreement with Socrates' position, right? Look what Socrates did. Exactly
what
Kant
did. Mediterranean Greek, hedonistic, and
that's right,
and lazy.
Unlike Kant, he probably has some hair on his chest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And he's not exactly white.
Exactly. And likes to drink.
That's
after
right.
hours.
That's right. So Kant does exactly what the Kantian perspective here is exactly the Socratic perspective. What did Socrates do? Socrates taught the youth to think for themselves, right? But insisted that even if they think for themselves, or interestingly, precisely because they think for themselves, they absolutely ought to obey. Just like Kant. What are we to do? What are we to do about that? Right? That's a question. And I want to suggest that if Socrates had disobeyed and just escaped, he would have been a much less interesting figure, right? He would have been much less subversive to the law, even, if he agreed to simply break it. What Socrates did by insisting to respect the law and think about it, what Socrates did by actually giving his life, while respecting the law and questioning it, is a truly subversive action. Perhaps we would have heard of Socrates if he chose to escape prison, but he would not have been the inspiring, interesting figure that is, right? He definitely would not have been a martyr and a Jesus-like figure that he is. That's Socrates, Moses. I would replace Moses with Abraham, but never mind that. Socrates, let's say Abraham, and Jesus, right? Those are the big figures. It has everything to do with this moment of being obedient precisely when defying the law. That promotes thinking for yourself. That promotes a certain responsibility, not the allegedly sheer disobedience, right? Which is in turn always then, so he just saved his own life, basically. No, Socrates was doing something more interesting than saving his own life. And that's my...
What is that thing, that more interesting thing that he's doing that is inspiring? I'm asking this question because I've taught this text many times, and it's very difficult to teach because it's extremely counterintuitive to say that someone who thinks that it's been unjustly sentenced, say, at the other end of the spectrum, you have Hobbes, right? Hobbes says, even if you are justly sentenced to protect your life, just flee. There's no moral obligation to give up your life.
Look, because in Hobbes, this right to protect your life is absolute. That's something that you obey, protecting your life. How lame is that? That's as lame as liberalism, if you'd like to be provocative, right? Here's the absolute: protect your life. Are there things that are higher than that? What is inspiring about Socrates is that he shows you that there are. It's very difficult to point out to what it is, right? I think what Socrates is pointing to, and it's not going to be accurately formulated. What Socrates is pointing to is to the possibility of being free while obeying. And if there is such a thing, then that's arguably greater than protecting your life. We are familiar with those problems from Nietzsche, say, this was about the baseness of liberal democracy. And, in many days, I'm a good liberal Democrat, despite the impression that I may give here.
Sometimes like your father with kosher.
I mean it though. I value that a lot.
You're famously liberal. That's why people hate you in your country, because you're liberal.
I think that's right. That, for example, is true. So when I need to go to the liberals' heaven, I will show that card.
Let me tell you what I take from Socrates' position, because it's not philosophical for me. I don't have a philosophical answer to that. I love that text, but I don't quite understand it, right? But I'll tell you what it means to me personally. It means the possibility of a political life, in the sense that if the solution to an unjust law is escaping, you just escape. But if unjust laws must be obeyed when it comes to your survival, then your only way out is changing the law. Your only way out is to create more just laws above your survival. And
but at least officially, Socrates does not run because he respects the law, right? He respects almost procedural justice in that sense, right? There was a trial. I was convicted, so I'm going to respect the law. I think there is something really deep about this respect to the law, because it is only against the backdrop of this, right, absolute respect that you understand how radical it is to question the law. Right? It's become too easy for us, again, as liberal modern Democrats. And, Athens maybe was a democracy, but it's become too easy for us to think, we can just question the law. Maybe we can choose what to obey and what to disobey and so forth. When Socrates shows you just how much he respects the law, you also understand just how radical he is when he questions it, right? And that's a greatness, I think, of Socrates, which is extremely difficult to understand today. That will also take us to a far-fetched corner, but I have a similar view of Abraham, whom I view as a disobedient figure.
Wait. I'll stop you there. Because I want to save Abraham for the last. Let me go a little bit from Socrates to Kant. There's a text by Kant, What is Enlightenment, that I've been in a class in which you were teaching this text. So
I don't remember, but I believe you.
Because in there, Kant makes a distinction between public and private that is confusing when the first time you read it, because it's the opposite of what we understand as public and private.
That's right.
And there's also an understanding of what it means to obey in the public domain and disobey in the private domain, and the other way around. Could you please explain a little bit this?
Yeah. So when Kant, I think we need to give some more background in order to even understand what we're talking about. So Kant says, think for yourself but obey, and that proposition has everything to do with the public-private distinction that you just alluded to. Namely, Kant says, because there is a public-private distinction, you can simultaneously think for yourself and obey. So you think for yourself in one sphere, and you obey in the other. So far, so good, I think.
Now, intuitively, contemporary people...
We're getting there. So intuitively, you would have thought, good. So I obey in the public sphere, and I disobey in the private sphere, like a good liberal, right? So I say, I'm a good liberal. My home is my castle. I can do in my home. I can behave as a king in my home. I do whatever I want. The state has no right to tell me how to live my life. When I'm at home, some things I should not come into camera, even jokingly, but I can do here whatever I want. Right? I can.
Don't give an example. Don't give an example.
I'm not giving an example. I'll just give the easy example. I can worship whatever God I want. I can eat whatever I want. I can go to sleep whenever I want to. I don't have to obey in the private sphere. In the public sphere, when I go outside, I have to put on a mask because the state suggested that I do. Surprisingly, Kant's position is exactly the opposite. His position is that in the private sphere, I have to obey. In the publicly, I have the right to think for myself. Why is that? It is because Kant's understanding of private and public is different from ours, and in an extremely significant, beautiful, important way. Private for Kant is always our limited perspective, precisely as who we are. I am a white middle upper class Israeli. I'm also a university professor. Those are my private perspectives as opposed to public, right? They are my private because they're mine, they're subjective. They sound public to modern ears because they have to do with a certain external appearance, external office or so forth. But they're really private. Holding a certain office as a professor, as a citizen of this or that state, this is just my private perspective. I may be a citizen of this state, but you're a citizen of another state. So that's really my private perspective, that I'm a citizen of this state or that I'm a professor. You're not. You may be a judge, you may be a soldier, and so forth. The public perspective for Kant is my ability to speak as an intellectual cosmopolitan, as someone who somehow transcends just the private perspective of speaking as a citizen, as a professor, as a judge, as a soldier, as Israeli, as a German, as a white person, and so forth. The ability to transcend that and to speak beyond that is my position as a public figure, right? So whereas I obey in the private sphere, I obey as a citizen, I obey as a professor, I give verdicts as a judge according to the law. While doing it, I also have the right, Kant should have said the duty, to think for myself, right? To think differently. That's precisely what you're seeing in the Socrates case, right? When you see a Socrates preaching or teaching in the public sphere how we should think for ourselves, arguing the case publicly, but still obeying the law. The judges have decided something, I obey the law, but I say what I think about it completely freely. Those are the basic Kantian distinctions. I take it, and that's where it becomes so important and so forgotten. I take it, the reason why we invert those perspectives between public and private is that we don't really have anymore a genuine belief in the perspective of the public, of what Kant meant by we don't believe that anyone can speak from the perspective of a cosmopolitan intellectual. You only speak as a professor. You only speak because you're privileged, white, middle upper class. You only speak as an Israeli. You never try to articulate the truth, big T truth, right?
Why don't we? It's because
Sorry?
of Second World. Why don't we? It's because of Second World
We
War.
don't believe in that anymore. I don't know if it's because of the Second World War. Frankly, I do think, well, I'm sure the Second World War is somehow responsible to everything, one way or another, that we're seeing.
It's the perfect excuse, yeah.
I think that goes, well, I really come across as attacking liberalism very harshly here. Liberalism also is on the rise because as a response to the Second World War, and importantly this way. I mean, I'm glad that a liberal world order has taken over in many ways, to be clear. But still, liberalism is fundamentally opposed to that public perspective, right? Because liberalism, as we know it in America, rejects the idea that truth, philosophical truth, should have much value or power in the public sphere, right?
But it says it doesn't exist.
But I don't know if it says it doesn't exist.
Yes.
Well, depending.
I wrote a dissertation about it.
I've read the dissertation. I thought it was very good.
So you were the one.
I better think it was very good. But yeah, somewhere on the spectrum between doesn't exist and shouldn't enter. I agree that it's in a way committed to its not existing, because if it did exist, then it should enter a public sphere. To that extent, I think we probably agree. But liberalism denies the importance of truth in the public sphere. And for that reason, it cannot but deny the place of the public thinking for oneself at the same time of obedience. That's a big problem with liberalism, because it encourages thereby a culture of one of two things, which are actually just one thing, but those are one of two things: either a culture of obedience or a culture of shallow disobedience, which, as I argued earlier today, is a form of obedience, just to base maxims. The possibility of disobeying by obeying something that's higher than what society decided is, in a way, almost non-existent for a liberal.
Okay, last two questions, because I want to steal more of your time. One is Abraham. You wrote a book about the binding of Isaac. It's an amazing book, let me just say that. I read it for this interview, in which you offer an interpretation of that episode in the Bible, in Genesis, in which it's a very famous, right? It's when God commands Abraham to kill his son in sacrifice. And the story in the Bible, as it today appears in the Bible, says that in the very last minute, when Abraham is about to kill his son, an angel appears and stops him. And this story has been interpreted, I don't mean by scholars, but I mean when you go to mass, if you're Christian, or when you go to probably a synagogue, in two ways. One is Abraham shows an extreme form of obedience to God, and that's why he's so special. He was willing to sacrifice his only son.
Mm-hmm.
And second, it's interpreted as God's morality, in the sense that at the end of the day, God doesn't want you to kill your son, right? At the end of the day,
some people have argued that. Yeah.
You offer interpretation that's quite the opposite of this. You're saying that what Abraham does is actually disobeying and not obeying. You offer a myriad of reasons that is an amazing interpretation of the text. Would you say that the angel intervention that stops Abraham's hand before he kills his son is a later interpolation in the text? It's an addition that came later. And you offer many reasons that are very convincing to explain that.
Thanks.
And they do, actually. I mean, and the text without the intervention of the angel that you argue appeared later, it's a text in which Abraham shows from the beginning doubts about obeying that command. Just for the listeners or viewers, to offer a couple of examples, the text says that Abraham takes 3 days from the moment he leaves where he is to the place where God asked him to sacrifice his son, when in truth these two places are separated by just an 8-hour walk. So 3 days, implies doubting, right? Among other things, right? Like several things that show, and therefore, when he's about to kill his son, which he's never about to kill his son, because the setting itself is wrong, everything in the sacrifice, everything is wrong, he himself stops himself and then sacrifices an animal instead of his son. But it's his decision.
I can summarize this very
sorry to explain your own book to
you do this very well. I mean it. You do this very very concisely and well. But God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only beloved son, and Abraham goes to the mountain. He shows many doubts along the way, but Abraham goes to the mountain, and in the end, he builds an altar. He puts his son upon the altar, binds him, and the text says, and they came to the place which God had shown to him, and Abraham built an altar there and put his son and put the wood upon the altar and his son upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. That's a moment painted by Caravaggio, Rembrandt, and so forth. And then the angel came and stopped him. The argument of the book, it's a philological argument, is that that angel actually is a later interpolation. And what you get in the text is, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. No angel, but Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. So on his own initiative, Abraham decides to take the ram and sacrifice it instead of Isaac. That's the argument of the book, and from there it goes to ask questions about, the theology of disobedience and so
on. Then there are two things that interest me a lot about this. One is what you're claiming, that this act of disobedience is precisely the founding moment of this strain of monotheism that ends up becoming Judaism and Christianity and later Islam, right? And you use an example that it's very, very convincing. That is the episode of Sodom and Gomorrah, in which Abraham argues with God and tries to convince him not to destroy these two cities, which God ends up doing. And at the beginning of this text, God is speaking to himself, and he's saying, should I hide this intention that I have with should I not tell Abraham?
what am I about to do?
Yeah, because Abraham will argue against it, but I need to tell him because that's the reason why Abraham exists, to contest my will, so to speak, right? So this interpretation means that Judaism or Abrahamic religions are there. Well, okay, but
we'll talk about that.
Okay, but in a way, are their specificity is their ability to morally confront God or ethically. I don't want to.
I think that again is very similarly to the case of Socrates. That's we tend to not understand the power of those religions. If we simply say, there is a certain shallow attitude among modern readers of that Binding of Isaac story to say, what a terrible story. It's a story about obedience. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son and Abraham obeys. It's terrible. That's a shallow response. But I want to say it would also be too shallow to say, great, so we discovered that now Abraham did the right thing. He did exactly what we wanted him to do. That too would be a shallow type of response. I think that those I'm not sure so much about Christianity here, I must say. So I want to say a word about this in a second, but I think the power of that story, the power of the theology that's being presented in that story, I'm not even sure that it's Judaism. Judaism obviously did not take that path, even though, well, it has strands that did, but whatever. The power, like in Socrates, is in understanding that there is a real dilemma there. That, God, who created the world, commands you to do something. What does it mean to disobey that God? Not obviously the right thing to do. Much deeper to understand that the choice that's being done in that moment is setting a certain example that will later on become the right thing to do. Whatever Abraham does was not done against the comfort of doing the right thing. You disobey God, it's scary maybe to disobey God, but it's scarier not to know whether you're doing the right thing. And the greatness of that story is, I think, in problematizing that. that whatever Abraham does, his choice is not safe because God commanded it. It would have been safe to kill your son if you do it because God commands you. And by the way, as I write in the book, I'm not sure if in the chapters that you've seen, people think it's crazy. People do this all the time where I come from, right? This God says a state commanding you to send your children to war. You do. People do this all the time, and it's relatively safe because you act on a certain principle. God commanded it. Scary as it is.
It's the beauty of obedience, right? It's you take
Exactly.
the responsibility off of you.
Exactly. And the same for disobeying. If disobedience is done for the right thing. It's wrong to kill my son, so God will send me wherever, but I will not do it because I'm doing the right thing. So I'm now protected by morality, which I made a higher God. Also comfortable. I think the power of this story is to precisely try to break that and show you that whatever Abraham does, he doesn't do against either of those comforts. And again, and possibly showing you something that's a higher form of action, one that is in that sense genuinely disobedient, maybe if there is such a thing, because it defies following what God says, and it's not obviously just doing the moral thing, it's something else. It's setting a certain example. That's basically, I think, the question. I have a problem here with Christianity, to be perfectly honest. I also have a problem with Judaism. I don't think this can be easily made comfortable on any religion. For me, the discomfort with Christianity and the story is that the story of the crucifixion of Jesus is modeled on the story of the binding of Isaac. Like Abraham was allegedly willing to sacrifice his only beloved son, God was willing to sacrifice his. It's difficult for me to overcome the need to read Christianity as very much committed to the obedient Abraham model to that extent. And I think that a lot of work needs to be done in order to think how you think about that perspective from a Christian position. Jews would have it easier if they accept my interpretation of the binding of Isaac. It would be easier to develop a certain Jewish attitude out of it. Obviously, it hasn't been the main strand of Judaism, but similar strands have existed. And it's very ironical because often Jews are presented in the history of philosophy as the people of the Torah, that is, of the law. People like to say it's coming from Hegel, at least. At least since Hegel, we're used to saying, Jews are the people of the law, because the Torah is about the law, and they just follow the law of the Torah. I think it's sheerly false about Judaism. It completely misunderstands what Judaism is and completely understands what the Torah is. The Torah does not just simply gives you laws that you follow. It gives you stories that you interpret, and you follow the examples set by the stories, not laws. And that makes the Jews something very different than the people of the law. In that sense.
Well, just to answer your point on Christianity, I could not say I've thought hard about this because I just read the book. So it's just a thought I had while reading the book, which is what is the difference between the binding of Isaac and crucifixion, besides the fact that one dies and the other doesn't. For me, there are two main differences. One is that Jesus is an adult, whereas Isaac is not. Jesus gives himself up.
There is an argument, by the way, that's part of the story of the prefiguration. According to the computation of the Jewish sages, Isaac is actually 30, also maybe even 33 when he's going there. So there is actually a debate.
Okay, well, let's say there's no human authority over Jesus to make the
Right.
decision on.
That's
And
right.
second, that Jesus is supposed to be God. So it's God giving himself up, not so much asking someone to give up something they love.
Sure.
It's his son in an analogous way. It's his son only in right. But anyway, I just don't want to go into the theological argument. I want to go to your book on Israel. Before I ask this question, I want your commitment that when the book is out, you'll send it to me and we'll have another conversation on the book itself.
Of course.
Because this way I feel less bad for not giving it much time.
No, you don't need to feel bad. We don't. I mean, we can talk about.
No. For me, I mean, you've talked about Israel a lot in this conversation. It's the example you have at hand, in the same way that I speak a lot about Catalonia or whatever, because it's the example I have. I have a thick
Let's
relationship.
face it, Jordi. I speak too much about Israel. You speak too much about Catalonia.
So what? What does too much mean? Nothing. It doesn't mean anything.
False, but never mind.
It doesn't mean anything too much. But I know, because I know you. I know you've been writing this book for a long time. Not for a long time, but longer than you wanted to. Sure. And because it's a topic that it's difficult, right, for you but Europe, people may not know this in Barcelona, even though you published an article in La Vanguardia some months ago about a topic that you keep going back to, which is that Israel is not a liberal state. And what does that mean for Israel that it's not? And you've published extensively in Germany, in Israel, and in the US, in the best publications there are to have this discussion. And you've distinguished yourself for being very critical with respect to what the State of Israel does, what the Israeli public does with what the State of Israel does. And your voice has become a very difficult opposition to overcome, because you come from there, it. Not only you have a book on the binding of Isaac, but you come from the context of hope that made the State of Israel what it is. That hope that's become, empty of its content. But when we started talking about this book, you told me that you wanted this book to be a proposal, not just a critique, because you've been writing a critique for a very long time, and now you come out with hope, or with what?
There is a proposal in the book. The proposal is called in the last chapter. It's called the Haifa Republic. Long story, but there is one important, I think, activity about Israel, which is criticizing it. We need to criticize it because we need to legitimize a certain form of saying some things that are true about Israel and are considered illegitimate to say. And we need to say them. And as I put it in the book, we need to say them and make it legitimate to say it, because if we will taboo the discussion of this reality, we will not be able to imagine alternatives to reality. We will continue basically lying to ourselves that reality is different from what it is. We need to finally understand what Israel is, which is not what many people think about it, and then be able to imagine something for the place that transcends this reality in which it is. The reality is a reality of a one-state solution already, not solution, but a one-state already, right? There's not going to be a two-state solution. Israel, we speak to, especially today, this was true already 2 years ago when I started writing, it's true today when a government coalition is announced that pledges to annex more territories in the West Bank. There's not going to exist a Palestinian state. So the question is, for pro-Israelis like myself, if you're just an anti-Israeli, then it's a different ballgame. But for pro-Israeli patriots like myself, the question is, how can you think Israel? How can you think that state? How can you think Zionism that's still democratic, and there is no Jewish democracy. Because there cannot be Jewish democracy where the majority of people are not Jews. As I argue, there also cannot be a Jewish democracy if the majority were Jews. Democracies should not be Jewish.
Let me stop you there for a second. Can you explain that? Because that is one of your most common arguments, and people may not know about it. You say Israeli constitution defines Israel as a Jewish state, or a Jewish
Israel doesn't have a constitution, but the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. What does that mean, and why is that important?
It's important because there is a familiar liberal Zionist claim that Israel is Jewish and democratic, because and that there is no contradiction between Jewish and democratic, because Judaism here is understood as a form of culture. So just as Spain is Spanish, Italy is Italian, Germany is German, and those countries are obviously democracies. Well, let's put it this way. Sure, Jody, we can actually make this extremely effective. Let's imagine that Catalonia came to exist as a sovereign Catalan state. Sure. It would be Catalan and democratic, one would hope. There's no contradiction between being Catalan and democratic. Where is the contradiction between being Jewish and democratic? If Judaism here is not understood as a religion, but rather as a culture, just like Catalan culture. The answer is easy, actually, and it is that who is Jewish and who is not has very little to do with cultural identity. It has everything to do with your ethnic identity and with your blood. I can be a Catalan Jew. I can be a Catalan. I can be a Jewish German, even, to just go directly to the end of the problematic comparison. But I cannot be an Arab Jew or a Muslim Jew. That's not possible. Israel is a Jewish state as opposed to an Israeli state. The point is simple. In the well-known European liberal democracies, which are also nation states, the nations are basically defined by citizenship. I am a German Jew in virtue of having a German passport. You can have then arguments about, deeper culture, about problems and so forth. But in the end, I'm part of the German people in virtue of having a citizenship, in virtue of having a German citizenship. I'm part of the Italian people in virtue of having Italian citizenship. And those states basically embody the sovereignty of the German people, the Italian people, one day perhaps of the Catalan people, and so forth. Israel embodies the sovereignty of the Jewish people, and people who are not Jewish are not part of that sovereign body in the same way. Only that 20, depends how you count, but 22, 23% of the population within Israel's declared borders are not Jewish. So you cannot pretend they are equal citizens. And, there's a small fact that in the last 50 years, Israel's actual borders encompasses about 3 million more Palestinians, so that it's basically almost 50% non-Jews within those borders. So that's first why Israel cannot be a Jewish state, cannot be a liberal democracy, unlike a Catalan state, unlike a German state. That's first, and we have to admit it. Second, just as today, an Israeli government is being sworn in, pledging to actually annex major territories in the West Bank, there ain't going to be a two-state solution if people haven't known this in the last, 5 years. It's actually now about 50% non-Jews in the claimed borders of Israel. There's no way around it. How can people who are still pro-Israeli, as I am, and I am, can think about the future of Israel? How can they think about Zionism? And the answer is the positive proposal, beyond just criticizing Israel, beyond just explaining why it cannot be a liberal democracy full stop, The positive proposal has to do with speaking about diminishing the claim to sovereignty and making the distinction between sovereignty and self-determination. Zionism historically was always about self-determination as opposed to sovereignty. And so I want to say that Jews and Palestinians can both exercise national self-determination side by side in a sovereign state where all of them are equal citizens. And I try to show first that that was the original plan of Zionism, such that my position actually does not even contradict Zionism. Often Zionists today look at people like me and say, oh, you're anti-Zionist. Well, I'm not actually. I try to show, no, I'm much more consistent with the original Zionism. That's first. Second, and this is really the last pages of the last chapter of the book, I try to show that Menachem Begin, Israel's first right-wing prime minister, actually made a plan that seemed very much like that. And that's interesting for Catalan readers, and obviously that Catalan, readers, listeners, viewers, whatever you want to call them.
The Catalan people, you can say.
Catalan people. Well, I'm not speaking to the Catalan people. You are. That's not. It's interesting, and it's a tricky example when you do speak to Catalans, because Begin's proposal, I am not going to endorse it word by word, far from it. He suggested giving citizenship to all Palestinians, full citizenship on the whole territory, full equal freedom of movement, economic rights on the whole territory of Israel, West Bank and not, and have a Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza. So that you will have the sovereign Jewish state and within it a Palestinian autonomy with full rights all across the board. That would definitely make the situation of Palestinians today much better than what it is. It would make them citizens of their own state because they would be citizens of the state of Israel. Obviously, Catalans may roll their eyes and say, well, we see where that has taken us. I will say, not in my defense, because I don't need to defend myself here. I would say that that's not the model that I'm actually proposing for Israel. I don't think that we need a Jewish state and within it Palestinian autonomy. We rather need a federative structure where you have Jewish self-determination and Palestinian self-determination, where everybody is equal as citizens of that federation. That's not quite the Catalan example. That's the proposal. And look, it's a proposal that in current Israeli Zionist eyes would often look as post-Zionist. I point out the fact that it's A, consistent with the origins of Zionism, B, that an Israeli prime minister actually proposed it, and here is the best part of what I'm about to say. Begin brought it in 1977, December, to vote in Israel's parliament. 64 parliament members voted for it, 40 abstained, and 8 were against. It passed. So there's nothing anti-Zionist about suggesting that. We need to revive programs of this sort in order to imagine a democratic future for Israel. The alternative would be apartheid, expulsions, and just the decay of democracy. That's basically the project of the positive part of the book, not just to criticize liberal Zionism, to show that actually we can imagine.
I see that part of your argument, or an important part of the argument as you laid it out here, is that persuasion. You're trying to persuade your fellow Israelis or whoever reads the book that this is consistent with who they are.
That's right.
And I think that's very interesting. Just I don't want to answer your position because I want to read the book first. I just want to point out one thing. and it's the following. Let's assume your proposal, is accepted. In my view, this proposal only makes sense. This is the Catalan approach to your proposal. It only makes sense if that autonomy that you're proposing has the right to self-determination. Because in the sense of independence, in the sense,
that would be for sovereignty as opposed to.
I know, but by right of self-determination, I mean that. I mean that they have that right, because otherwise, it looks to me, from my perspective, of course, as coercion, because it's either you accept this or your current situation. But if the argument is this is the best for everyone, let's try it, but you will always retain within the boundaries of your autonomy the possibility of self-determining yourself legally. Then that's consent. Otherwise, it's not. Otherwise, it's coercion, because it's either war or this autonomy.
Well, it's a matter of fact that it's either war or this autonomy.
It is. It is.
But note again and again, I'm not suggesting the Catalan example because
I know. I'm just problematizing.
Because we're talking here about the two different.
Very different.
I think that the Jews should also exercise self-determination as opposed to sovereignty. That's extremely important. So that sovereignty is shared, rather than you have a sovereign state and within it an autonomy. That's an important distinction, Jordi. About having this as basically you're saying the technical terms would be it needs to be a confederate constellation rather than federative constellation, because
I'm even willing to accept a state design in which the autonomy of the Palestinians is much lower than whatever you're imagining, as long as there's an opt-out, as long as that possibility exists. It doesn't need to be actualized, but
if it exists either through consent or through war. I mean,
exactly. So it must.
The possibility exists. The question is whether the right will exist. Whether a right for that.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
In the constitution, so that if there is a constitution that says we have now a certain federative structure, and it has a constitution, and the Jews have national self-determination. The Palestinians have national self-determination, but sovereignty belongs to them together. But in that constitution, each of those bodies can just leave. Right? That's what you're saying, basically. So they would have the right to leave. It would not be living by force, or it would be basically by right. Well, the Israelis would say, great, I mean, we just leave. But the problem is that the populations are living within one each other, right? So,
look, Amos Oz, the Israeli writer. How do you say it? Amos Oz?
Amos Oz. I've heard about him.
I has this book that's called
for the Fanatics.
Yeah. In which he says something that it's interesting. He says, Europeans tend to tell us that we should love each other, and this is just stupid, as if we didn't know each other. We know each other. The problem here is that we both peoples have reasonable claims to the same land, and also unreasonable, but we both have reasonable claims to the same piece of land, and that is the problem. That not,
Jordi, Amos Oz's position is passé.
I know.
And his position is dead as well. And he's been, when you read my book, you will see very harsh criticism of Amos Oz very directly. I think it's been extremely harmful, among other things. an interesting writer, and if Israel was going according to his politics, things would have been much better than they are. But I think he's also doing a lot of apologetics for the wrong causes. Used to.
I don't pretend to. I cannot argue with you on Israel or anything related to Israel in the material aspect of it. I'm just saying that from what I know of the world, if I'm hearing your proposal in a very sketchy way in this conversation, without having read the book, my only the principle I hold on to is that I will always be willing to share sovereignty with everyone, in truth, as long as when it comes to territoriality, that's why I was mentioning Amos Oz, not for other reasons. When it comes to territoriality, there always exists an opt-out option. And for me, that's like, it's like the maybe I should call it ethical and not political, but there's the political threshold of consent.
We speak, not surprisingly, from opposite perspectives, and not surprisingly, not because you're Catalan and in that sense more similar to the Palestinian and I'm an Israeli.
No.
But rather because of the perspective of time. You're speaking from the perspective, despite everything. I know that you and your Catalan viewers will be angry. You speak from a perspective of relative comfort and power here.
Correct.
Not relative, a lot, if you compare your situation to the Palestinians.
Correct, absolutely.
The right to opt out right now would be the right of the Israelis to say, we don't want that federation, so we want to opt out. Only little problem with it. Sorry?
And then you renounce the land.
No, but that's precisely the problem. I mean, then Israel has a power, and that's it. They will not renounce the land. They will just take over it. I mean, they are there already, right? That's why they have the settlers. The politics on the ground are such that if you want to protect the Palestinians, you cannot say basically, let's have a federation, and Israel, which basically easily swallows Palestine, easily. I mean, Israel could win by military the whole Arab world, more or less, in 6 days. The Palestinians really are no power. Israel can just say, actually, we want to opt out. Only we have 700,000 settlers here in the middle of Palestine, and they're staying.
Let me put it this way. What you're saying is that, if you want the land, you should have the people. That's what you're saying.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is that I agree with that. If that is also true the other way around, which is if you don't want the people, then you can have the land. And what you're saying is that Israelis will never accept that because they have the army to not having to accept that. Right. And that is a realist argument that I respect, and I think you're trying to find a solution for that problem. And I think that's probably a very good solution, the best available, probably. But I think that from an outside perspective, I don't have a horse in the race. I don't have emotions invested. I don't know the history. I don't know the text. I don't know anything. From the structure of the argument, that is missing, and that's why it's coercion, because it's either this or war. You know.
Well, the war is taking place.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. The other thing is also your war is political, Jordi, and this is something that you taught me actually, and you may have forgotten. I spoke about this in Austria one day, and that was extremely important for me because I was already writing the book, and I was worried that my model is similar to the Catalan, which basically is a reductio ad absurdum, right? Because Catalans want out, or many of them want out. And you actually but you pointed out to me something important in that, and that's a fundamental asymmetry on another level between the Israel, Palestine, Spain, Catalan comparison, and it is this. And you will now correct me if I'm wrong. Spain, in a way, wants to swallow Catalonia. Right? They want you to be part of them, and this is what you don't want. This is why you want to preserve your autonomy, and you feel that you cannot even maintain this autonomy. That's maybe one reason why Catalans want out. Maybe one reason. I mean, that's complicated, and I'm not going to make too many descriptions. That's never going to be the Israeli case, because Israel precisely doesn't want to swallow Palestine. It wants the territory, sure, but it absolutely does not want the Palestinians to become part of the Jewish state, right? That's not the case. It's just the opposite in that sense. So the need to protect the Palestinians' ability not to have the Israelis demand that they become Jewish is not the same as, to my understanding, the familiar situation in Catalonia, where Spain basically says, yeah, well, you guys should just be, in the end, Spanish. That's not the situation. And for that reason, the pressure is on that right to opt out.
Sorry.
No, for two reasons, I think it's diminished. A, because we're not speaking about an Israel in my imagination. This is just my imagination, right? My fantasy. It's not an Israel that has an autonomy within it. A lot of your insistence on the ability to opt out has to do with this. Well, this is Spain and we're inside it and we need to opt out. No, those are two equal bodies in that sense. Both are autonomies within a sovereign constellation. That's one. And second, because the sociology and the politics of the matter is such that the Israelis would not try to, would never, again, let me be blunt. They're too racist in order to want to swallow the Palestinians. We don't want them as part of our state. That's your Amos Oz moment, by the way, right? I mean, he famously wanted a divorce. This is his way of putting it. We don't need to continue making love. We need to finally divorce from the Palestinians. Well, guess what? You haven't managed to do this in the last 50 years, and we're together in bed. So we better make it work out somehow together.
Change the shit, right? No, at least. What you took from that conversation is yours. So I don't want to correct it. I want to tell you what I took from that conversation, because that conversation was a two-way. That conversation in Austria. You taught me two things. You taught me that I am a nationalist, and I thought I could create an argument for independence that was not nationalist, because the word is so hated by liberal academia, and we all want to be accepted. You told me that. You taught me that. You taught me that my point about wanting that culture to become political, or wanted that nation to become a state, that's nationalism, no matter what, how you express it. And that was very valuable, because that reconciled my ideas with what I want. And second, you taught me something much more important, which was, you said, be careful, because nationalism can be a liberating force that may liberate your country. But look at Israel. You could end up breeding the kind of ideas that will end up turning your nation into something hateful.
That's right.
And I took that very seriously. And I think that part of the reasons, some of the reasons why I decided to go into politics with both an explicit claim to nationalism and at the same time an explicit rejection of the political culture that the pro-independence movement has, or at least the leaders have put on the table, comes from that conversation. And since we're talking about it, I just want to thank you for opening my eyes to that. And just to finish, why is your book entitled Israel Utopia in German and A Future for Israel in English?
Well, I mean, there are the boring answers and there are the interesting answers. I guess part of the boring answers is that there were many debates with the publishers about what's going to be the right title that's going to sell and so forth. And a lot of, if I were to choose a title for my book completely autonomously, I would have had the same title in German and English. It would have been Altneuland. Altneuland. That's the name of Herzl's famous book, basically imagining the Jewish state. Altneuland meaning basically an old new land, right? An old because it's state, the country from the Bible, but new for the Jews. This idea of something that's old and being renewed again, right? It was always fundamental for Zionism. By the way, many people don't know this. Even many Israelis don't know this. You know how you say Altneuland in Hebrew? Tel Aviv. That's when Altneuland was translated into Hebrew for the first time. They used a slightly poetic Hebrew in order to put it in Hebrew, and they said Tel Aviv, and in the end, Tel Aviv became Tel Aviv after that. I thought that it makes perfect sense to call the book Altneuland or an old new land, because the idea was to now take Herzl's ideas and to think them anew, an old new concept again, and thereby also to make it clear that it's committed to a lot of the Zionist aspirations of national self-determination for Jews and so forth. The publisher said, listen, this is really nice, but it's not going to sell anything because nobody but some experts would understand this allusion. After some, then the publishers didn't want to have Zionism, two-state solution, stuff like that. They mostly did not want to have this on the title. In the end, I called my book in German Israel Utopie because first, to express the irony, because Israel is definitely not a utopia right now. But second, also to express the certain hope that we can boldly imagine possibilities beyond the situation right now. Herzl's Altneuland had the motto, Wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen. If you will it, it is not a dream. It was a utopian model. So in a way, by calling the book Israel Utopia, I basically return to this Herzlian utopian motto, which I think we need to preserve. In English, A Future for Israel Beyond the Two-State Solution speaks more directly, I think, to the perhaps better informed American market. People know the debates about Israel better, and they know what this two-state solution means. They know what going beyond it would mean, and so forth. So it was more directly,
Yeah, maybe Germans think that utopias exist, and Americans are sure they don't. So
That's right.
that's... Anyway, thank you, Omri, for this very long conversation. It's been a pleasure. I miss this conversation so much. I hope the era of travel is not over, and the era of masks is over soon, and we can see one another and hug as in the old times.
I trust we can.
Thank you.
Kisses. Bye-bye.